Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. You know how we do this. Today's guest is, well, he's back again, and I always love having him on because we get smarter, we get tougher, we throw rigor into really hard problems. And today, it's Dr. Wil Reilly from Kentucky State University, a historically black college university, and we're going to talk about woke ideology. And he's going to challenge it and break it down and say, here are the areas where this stuff starts to break down. For example, we can say Breonna Taylor's name, but do we know Dylan Noble's name? And do we understand if these things are important, do we truly understand what police use of forced death stats are? And if we don't, well, then we got work to do. We got to take this stuff seriously because these are really complex problems. These are not univariate problems. These are not strictly racial problems. Are there racial issues in the U.S.? For sure. And Dr. Reilly talks about that. But we have other issues, other variables that go into this problem. So if we start with a racial premise, I would submit you start with intolerance. You cannot have a tolerant solution come out of the machine. And so when you start with a racial premise, you start to leak out the logic and you bring in the emotion and you get off track on what the real problem is. It's not to say that they're not problems. It's not to say that we can't address them. It's let's really define these problems. And I think we do a great job of that in this episode. And keep in mind, if you're not paying attention on the Break It Down show, we bring a lot of perspectives in because these are not simple things. Academics don't have the answer alone. The folks on the street don't have the answer alone. The artists don't have the answer alone. And that's why we bring all these different people in to illustrate these problems. So we're talking about reality from the very granular truth. And today we're going to get it hard. We can all take it. We need more of these conversations. We can handle the rigor. So dig in, get ready. And if you're going to get mad, good. Stay for the whole show then and see what we can learn from this thing. See if we can understand each other. And if you're already understanding how complex these things are, good. Now go listen to the other side and figure out how we all work on these things together. Because what we all want is love, less violence, more prosperity for people. So let's figure out how to do that. Let's be smart about it. And let's all love the Break It Down show. Anytime you can share the show, it helps. It's like money in my pocket. If you buy the books on Amazon, Wil has 2 fantastic books. There's one called Taboo, 10 Facts We Can't Talk About, and there's a Hate Crime Hoax book. I think both of these books are pillars that found his work and where he's at, how he's trying to help society move forward so we can all slow down and go, hey, these are complex problems. I highly recommend those books. If you get them on Audible, if you get them on Amazon, click our links. It really helps out. We get a little bit of money each time. That's a good way to help support the show. All right, one more thing I'm going to say to you. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. Throw a little bit of money in each month. Click that donate tab. Do whatever it is that you do. Give us a boat. Give us that property. Whatever it is, we're going to put it to work to help and save veteran lives. Now, the last thing I'm going to say. Get ready. Here comes Wil Reilly.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Morata.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Of course, I've said it a couple times before. I was glad to say it again. This is Dr. Wil Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down show with Pete Turner.
Yeah, I did a little bit of a vamp here while we were waiting, and you were being kept safe from COVID. Always a pleasure to have you on. I'm excited to have this conversation because I'm a guy that works on understanding. You know, that's my combat experience as a spy was dealt on. You know, I'm trying to find these points where we can nudge towards each other a little bit, right? If we can get a little closer, we can create more understanding. Because there's a few things. I talked about laws of culture before you came on, but these are cultural problems. You know, if you don't understand this already, culture is omnipresent, and that means it impacts everything. And the better you get at intersecting rather than designing or colliding, you'll be more adept at culture. You'll develop cultural acuity. And race, I mean, we know, if we believe in science, we know that race is sort of a cultural construct. You know, I mean, yeah, there's skin tone differences, but that doesn't change how you think as a person. And so these experiences oftentimes are cultural things. So I want to talk a little bit about, another thing I wanted to say too, as we go into this, is that populations that feel oppressed, disenfranchised, threatened, from my experience, will overinflate the problem. It's not because they're dumb. It's not because they, you know, are trying to accomplish something, but they're in this zone of damage. You know, whether they're Iraqis or Afghans or any oppressed people, and they'll overinflate the threat and the negativity around them because it really is a lot of what they know. And that's this confounding factor where you're taking someone's reality and they develop, you know, like Shaka Senghor said it. He's like, you know, most of the people in my family have been shot. Prison is an extension of our community. Why wouldn't we have PTSD living in a place like that? So we have these structures around what we're trying to deal with as a society, and we're going to talk about I guess the woke ideology. So I wanted to put that premise out there, and then I want to get into just so we can understand, how are you defining woke ideology or that whole premise, and then we'll dive into the questions.
Okay, that's a good question. So for me, wokeness, and I lean kind of center right, but I'm not one of these conservative guys that defines everyone that disagrees with you as, like damn red communist. But woke ideology, to a very real extent, does come out of Marxism. It comes specifically out of the Frankfurt School of Philosophy, and it comes out of the School of American and West European postmodernism. To avoid being too blah, blah, blah with this, in a sentence, wokeism basically is the idea that what look like facially neutral systems are in fact tools of some kind of sophisticated oppression. So James Lindsay or Helen Pluckrose, a critic of this for a living, would tell you that these are best called critical theories. But the original critical theory was simply critical Marxist theory, which is the idea that what look like facially neutral systems of law, for example, actually exist to protect the property of the rich. What looks like an organized, well-ordered society is in fact entirely set up to benefit rich people. There are property rights because they protect the rich. There's a system of higher education that starts costing money at a certain level because that makes it cost money to be rich. Now, again, there's significant problems with this. I mean, laws against corporate crime, in fact, target specifically and entirely the rich and are actually pretty well enforced. Most other laws, like those against rape, are broadly supported by the rich and the poor, but that is critical Marxist theory. What looks like a facially neutral society is, in fact, set up to benefit the big hogs, the fat cats, the rich guys. All other critical theories are basically footnotes to communism. So critical race theory just basically takes class and substitutes the words black people or race more broadly outside of America. So what looks like a facially neutral system of laws or college application, whatever else you might have, military service, virtually anything, arrest mechanism for police departments, is in fact set up to institutionalize and incarcerate and oppress black people. Then there's critical feminist theory. Everything we think normal, pregnancy is not considered a medical condition, is in fact designed to oppress women. The definition of rape, for example, so on down the line. And this really, I at least think those three are worthy opponents, but this has recently gone almost off the rails. I mean, you have critical fatness theory, which is the idea that society is set up to benefit skinny warriors, which it kind of is. But go to the gym, lose weight. I mean, these are not the same thing, but you're now seeing more and more of this kind of stuff. I mean, of course, there are a few people with some kind of biomedical condition, but in general, this is being extended into silly arenas. So we're no longer talking about equality between the two primary sexes or genders. We're arguing that there are 158 genders and talking about things like the employment gap between all of them. But I'm not really focused on that. The primary critical theories, sex, race, class, perhaps age, are derived from this Marxist idea that facially neutral systems are oppressive. And what I think we're going to talk about today, and quite frankly, I'm going to use this, you're one of my favorite people to talk to, as prep for sort of corporate speeches. I mean, a 1 hour response to some of the woke training that these large companies are now requiring people to go to, is the responses to this. With the focus on this idea, like, are disparities really due to discrimination, one? And two, do a lot of these gaps even exist? Like, are poor whites better treated than black people, or is that just bullshit?
Yeah, well, let's dive in with that exactly. Let's talk about the police, death, and use of force deaths and race. I mean, there's a super steep cliff right there. Let's jump off.
Yeah, so the first starting example that wokies almost always use with this stuff when they're trying to bring in sort of high school kids is, well, haven't you seen the George Floyd video? And before that, haven't you seen, the Michael Brown conversation? Haven't you seen the Trayvon Martin case? Is there any doubt, I'll often be asked when I speak at high schools and colleges, that the police are murdering black people in great numbers? And this is a good example of how much of this stuff is just nonsense. It is based around false premises and the facts aren't true. Now, I will say, obviously, I'm a man of color. I strongly oppose police brutality. I mean, You were a combat soldier. I myself am a weapons instructor. There's nothing worse than abusing, not those are the same thing, but there's nothing worse than abusing people with a technique or a technology that you have. That's not tolerated. But in fact, the numbers simply don't support the idea that there are a large number of Black people or of people in general being killed by American law enforcement officers. So just starting with kind of the dry facts, I mean, in the most recent year on record, 2019, the total number of unarmed Black people killed by the police was 14. That was listed as 9, by the way, by the Washington Post, kind of the gold standard in this field. They keep an entire database. For the better part of a year, when I and other researchers started really looking at this, they added a couple cases that had previously been sort of listed as undefined, perhaps as biracial. But sure, let's accept 14. The total number of all unarmed men, and for that matter, unarmed people, those are almost identical figures because men commit almost all crime, which we'll get into, but killed by police in the year we're talking about was under 60. There were less than 1,000 people total, including all those challenging an officer with a knife or a gun or a baton that were shot by police. That's 1,000. It was 999 out of 60 million police-civilian interactions. So very often these claims right off the bat that are based on a couple of spectacular videos just collapse. One more sentence there. I mean, you can argue that the number of Black people killed, if you look at the total, it's about 250 out of 1,000. That's 25%, whereas we're only 14% of the population. You could argue that 10% overrepresentation is due to racism, but even there, the argument fails. If you look at the annual crime report, there is a definitely higher Black violent crime rate, just as whites dominate opiates or dominate corporate crime. We can't make excuses for that in the Black community. It was a 2.3 times the white rate. So if you adjust for that, even that small disparity, that vanishes, that goes away. So very often when you look first at question 1, what are the actual numbers? And question 2, what else is at play besides race? Are Black people younger, poorer on average? These gaps that are attributed to racism simply vanish. Thanks for asking that. It's a great first example. And the short answer is no, there's no evidence of massive massacre of Black people or people by the cops at all.
We know this to be true. We've had this conversation on the show, not just you and I, but a lot of us, a dozen times at least. Cops are not out actively hunting Black men. It's just not a thing, and killing them. The amount of deaths, just to put into perspective, are on par with a tree falling and crushing you. I mean, that's literally as likely, if not less likely than that. And if you take all of these use of force deaths, there's a lot of things where everybody goes, yeah, look, that person had to die because it's a dangerous job. They wanted to do suicide by cop. Another aspect of this that's always interesting to me is we have to say their names. And of course, we want to remember tragedy and we want to improve. And we want to say the name Breonna Taylor. However, we have to get the facts right in these cases. And also, we seem to have forgotten about Dylan Noble, who's a white kid in Fresno who got shot. And they kept shooting him even when he was dying on the ground. So why are we looking at one group of people to remember their names and not looking at police violence in general? I mean, this is the big question, right? Like, if there is a problem, shouldn't we know more than Breonna Taylor's names for people that were killed in no-knock or knocks, warrants, and then someone, innocent or not, gets killed? We should know more about this if we actually care about this problem and if it's a human problem, because death is a human problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely well put. So again, these are a couple more things worth noting. Whether or not you think that Black people are killed at a slightly disproportionate rate. I mean, I just gave the exact percentages there, and we can debate, is that due to residual racism or is that due to that higher crime rate? I think it's the higher crime rate. The most basic fact is that 75 to 80% of the people that are killed by the police every year are Hispanic white or Caucasian whites or Hispanics. Nobody even disputes this. So when you hear, say their names, I mean, a very simple question I ask when I speak to men's groups or athletic teams or something like that is, during the same year, there were these 200 awful Black cases. There were, let's say, 750 white and Hispanic and Asian cases of individuals, 40 plus unarmed, killed by the police. Name one. No one ever can. Sometimes a working class white guy with a union background will name Timpa or Dylan Noble. I mean, those are the Shaver, maybe Daniel Shaver. Those are the only names I've ever heard anyone bring up, 3 out of nearly 1,000 every year. So yeah, first of all, if you want to talk about police violence as an overall societal problem, it's absolutely immoral to ignore the 80% majority of the people killed and just to fend that off with a line like, oh, well, that's slightly disproportionate. We care about these names over here. Again, this is entirely political. The image that's being created, what's done is that you take these genuinely sympathetic individuals. Like, I have no problem saying Breonna Taylor's name. You take these genuinely sympathetic people, and then you skip over a lot of other stuff, and then you say, and 1,000 people were killed this year. And the impression that's left in people's minds is that 1,000 Breonna Taylors were killed, and they were all Black. No. 80% of the people that were killed were Caucasian, including Hispanics, Caucasian Hispanics, and the large majority of them and of the Black guys were criminals. I mean, you've got to remember that only 10% at most of those shot by the police, of those killed by the police, were unarmed. The largest category, if you go to that Washington Post database, well over half were in the category had a gun, had a loaded firearm. So you don't have 1,000 Breonna Taylors, you have 1,000 warrior age men with weapons, and you have, again, 9 maybe Breonna Taylors. That's a dramatic spin on available information. I will say, even the Breonna Taylor case, this is one where I'm sympathetic, but again, you had this great line. It's important to get the facts out there. We're adults. It's important to talk about what actually went on. The street reports that come out early on in these cases are always wildly dishonest, always wildly wrong. I'm a young or at most early middle-aged man. I teach at a Black college. I play basketball in Frankfurt, Louisville. The story I first heard about Breonna Taylor outraged me. I mean, it was, a young nurse. She's asleep in her bed. Cops kick in the door of the wrong apartment. They're racist. They shoot her. None of that is true. The police went to the correct address because Miss Taylor's boyfriend was a D-boy, a drug dealer, her ex-boyfriend. He was one of the larger drug dealers in Louisville. I mean, if you read through the actual transcripts that were released by Tatum Report and a dozen blogs on the center right, his nickname was El Chapo. He was moving at about a half-key level if you look at what you buy for $14,000 in the cocaine game. You and I are both casually familiar with those prices, not that we're going to change businesses. But I mean, Breonna Taylor was the 4th person named on a series of no-knock warrants because this guy was such a serious drug dealer. Police come to the apartment. They, in fact, knock, according to witnesses that are Black taxpayers in the building. Okay, I mean, so not perfect policing. They were aggressive. They showed up late, but they knock on the door. They probably say police. They come in, and Taylor's boyfriend, who believes they're her ex-boyfriend's fighters, again, he wasn't the nicest guy in the world, shoots at them and almost cripples a cop. I mean, he shoots a cop in the leg. The officer is down, and the officers return fire with the guy next to them. They're administering first aid. They're worried about this guy. Their friend's just been shot. So that's what actually happens. It's a terrible tragedy that in the exchange of gunfire between these police officers, who seem like quite decent guys, good cops in at least 2 of the 3 cases, and the boyfriend who thought his house, his castle, was being raided by opponents, this young woman was killed by these not evil men shooting at one another. But it's impossible to present that as a murder on either the police side or on Mr. Walker's side. I mean, that's not how a court's going to view that. That's not what that was. The police came to the correct address. They served a legal warrant. They were taken under fire. They returned fire. I mean, I don't see how anyone with a legal background or a police background could describe that as, at least in any technical sense, a homicide. So again, when you look at these cases, 1, they're never what they were presented as being early on. That's worth keeping in mind. 2, there are very few Breonna Taylors overall. The large majority of them involve armed criminals engaging the police. And 3, 80% of those armed criminals are Hispanic or white. Those are facts. There's no doubt about that.
As a guy that's been in gunfights, especially when we break down a door to go get a bad guy, on occasion when you do stuff like that, and by the way, when we're going after these bad guys, we're not going after saints. We're going after people that are killing people, or they're doing something that's so illegal, we're willing to take this extreme action. Granted, I'm doing it in a combat zone, but these are SWAT teams going in. These are, in fact, combat people. If you live in a place where a gunfight breaks out, you are no longer in charge of your mortality. It's in the hands of chaos. And so these things happen, thankfully here, very rarely. But I've seen situations where completely innocent people have been killed because the person in their house or their next door neighbor was a horrible person. And, they died in part because of this action that has to happen for the greater good. I'm not saying the cops are right or wrong, but when you live and you exist in a gunfight, your mortality is not in your hands, and anything can happen. Combat doesn't care about you taking a nap or you're a good person. It just takes what it takes, and then it leaves. It's horrible. the Breonna Taylor case and all these other cases aside, we do have a problem with interracial violence. I mean, at least it seems that way to me. Can you help us wrap our heads around what this looks like in terms of, because we have this sense that there are only black and white people in this nation and that only white people are racist. We hear this all the time, but the reality on crime is what?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And like I said, I mean, we're running through these in a sequence. I think it's important to have kind of that condensed hour and a half of people actually taking on some of these myths. So to kind of swing at the softball, I mean, to hit the pitch, no, we don't just have white on black interracial crime in the USA. And no, not only whites are racist. So one of the things that the mass media is doing, along with this presentation of police violence, is this presentation of overall interracial crime as being very pervasive. And as, let's say, just watching maybe MSNBC, like 80% white on black. So you see all these stories like Barbecue Becky, this woman disturbs a black family barbecuing, chases them around until they have to leave a public park. This is presented as fairly commonplace. It started a hashtag grilling while black. Coupon Carl, Pool Party Paula, all this stuff. You see these constant impressions of interracial fighting, especially white attacks on blacks. And we can dismiss this one pretty quickly. One, interracial crime is a tiny percentage of crime, and two, it's minority on white. So if you look at that percentage, first of all, interracial crime is about 5% of crime. Let's rephrase that to be technically accurate. Black on white or white on black, violent crime together, that's about 5% of crime. So in a typical year, and you can find this just by Googling Bureau of Justice Statistics Crime Report 2018-2019, there are about 12 to 20 million crimes. Serious crimes worth reporting, crimes that have a victim, report them. And this doesn't include drug crimes, penny ante stuff. 12 to 20 million serious crimes. We're a fairly high crime country. Of those, 600,000 or so, pretty much every year, are violent crimes that include either a black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a black victim. So 600,000 over at the minimum 12 million, that's 5%. Now you can say that I'm only counting violent crimes in the interracial category, whereas the 12 million includes some property crimes, but I'm also comparing the 600,000 to 12 million, not 20 million. I mean, it's just 5% of crime is a reasonable figure for interracial violent crime. Person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife. If you look at murder and most other serious crimes, I mean, 85% of white murder victims, 93% of black murder victims are killed by co-racialist people within the same race. So first of all, there's very, very little serious interracial crime. And that shouldn't really surprise anyone. I mean, when you think about the groups in America that are considered tough, quote unquote rednecks, inner city blacks, quote unquote hillbillies, Hispanic guys in El Barrio. What are the chances of any of those four groups traveling 200 miles to rob a group of equally poor people in a neighborhood where they'd be greatly outnumbered? I mean, that doesn't happen. It's extraordinarily rare. Most crimes like domestic violence, wife beating, those occur within the same group. Targets are often women. Even robbery often is black on white, but the targets are helpless, older, rich people. Crime's pretty predictable. The criminal is not the buffalo bull defending the herd. The criminal is the predator. The criminal is the guy skulking around the edges, trying to find a wounded calf, trying to make an easy meal. One of the most common crimes is purse snatching. So interracial crime, extremely rare. Point two, when it does occur, it's about 80% black on white. This is the other thing that's never mentioned. The first part, you sometimes hear conservative media say, well, this doesn't happen very often. Stop your whining. But it seems taboo to mention what actually is going on. I mean, if you want to go into, say their names territory, in a typical year, for example, 2013, when they separated whites from Hispanics in the crime stats, the policing stats for that year, there were 500,000+ black on white crimes, and there were 103,000, I believe, could be 123,000 white on black crimes. And again, none of this is especially surprising. Doesn't mean black people are evil. There are more whites and they have more money. I mean, the actual math is more complicated than this, but the white population is almost exactly 5 times the black population. Black people have a higher overall crime rate. I've mentioned our violent crime rates twice the white average at least. But the core facts are as they are, even though you can't really get an alt-right interpretation out of that either. If you want to talk about interracial crime, it's 80% minority on white or black on white. So you can really answer this in a sentence. Interracial crime is 5% of crime. First of all, it shouldn't be a major national focus of media coverage. And when it does occur, it is very heavily, you could say almost always, minority on white. So again, this narrative that there are pool party Paulas out there, that if you're black and you're walking down the street, you're going to be attacked by a white thug. This is a direct flip of the truth. And it sometimes almost seems like there's an attempt by politicians or by reporters, mostly on kind of that political center left, to make us feel afraid, worried about different things. I mean, these are the odds of being robbed by a white guy if you are an in-shape black guy are extraordinarily low. There are, 40 million black people, and the total number of all white on black crimes was 103,000. I mean, those are infinitesimal 1 in 400 odds. If you live a full 100-year life, you have a 1 in 4 chance of being violently attacked by a Caucasian.
That is not very often.
Not very. Nope.
One of the, it's when you get to these big numbers, it can be a little heartless. You know, again, Breonna Taylor is still dead. You know, it's still a tragedy. When grandma gets mugged by whoever, whether it's a white dude or a black dude, these are still tragedies. I know I grew up in a town, very small, wonderful, beautiful place, primarily white, but mixed in its own way. And next door is more industrial, harder. They didn't recover from the demilitarization of the bases in that area. And so a lot of times the crime just comes over. You know, like if you were going to have your stereo stolen, it was the guys from Vallejo coming over to take a stereo because everybody in Benicia already had a stereo. They didn't need to steal one. Not being unfair, but that's sort of the thing. They come to our town to break the window on your car to grab your backpack because it's a good chance it's a laptop in it. No one in Vallejo is dumb enough to leave their laptop in their car. So that drives some of that racial action anyhow. It's like, where is the money at? There's a mall in Vallejo, not a big one, but for us, it's important. If you want to get robbed, walk around there unawares, and either your car or yourself, you'll be a target because that's where money is. And so whether it's white people, Mexican people, Chinese people, whatever it is, criminals are going to go and take money from whomever has it. And this seems to me more like a class thing. Is that a fair assumption, or am I missing the mark?
Yeah, and that almost gets into one of the next things we're going to talk about. But yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, actually. I hadn't considered it in the context of crime as much as that in the context of other things. But just basically put, if you adjust for some very simple things like age, class, southern residency, urban residency, most differences between whites and blacks, and for that matter, other groups, disappear. Or at least they shrink substantially. I don't want to exaggerate, but I don't think that's especially disputed in social science. So yeah, I mean, when you look at black versus white crime, I mean, in cities, and again, hard right or alt-right writers often focus on specific high crime cities. And I'll say something like, well, in Detroit, the black crime rate is 10 times the white crime rate. And I suspect that's probably true, but that's because you're looking at an isolated case where all the working class whites fled Detroit to the surrounding high crime white suburbs where they filmed 8 Mile, and all the working class blacks stayed. And the whites that moved into Detroit were upper middle class kids who wanted to do things like organically farm. So it's not really much doubt which way the crime is going to trend there. I mean, if you look at, for example, the larger cities in Appalachian, West Virginia, or Kentucky, not as much violence, but you're going to have a sky-high crime rate when you look at opiates, DUI, domestic abuse, so on. So the real comparison is that, a white, poor city, Charleston, West Virginia, versus Detroit. It's not a well-off white neighborhood in Detroit versus a poor black neighborhood in Detroit. And again, if you compare, one of the points I make often, if you compare a white guy, a black guy, and an Asian guy who are the same age, they're both from a father-present home, they're both from the North, they're the same person, they're probably going to have very similar life outcomes. And I would suspect, although this isn't something I research very much, that includes crime, yeah.
Interesting. And then in terms of these racial gaps that we hear about from the woke ideology side, generational wealth is one of the things they say all the time. I want to understand that better. I mean, I know that these are multivariate problems, and it seems that we overplay the race thing to the detriment of reason and logic. So when we look at these numbers, it's like, yeah, but these people are black. They're being targeted specifically by a system or whatever. So let's talk about income inequality. And, look, I just did a whole series of shows on the criminal justice system. And there's no doubt that black men are being chewed up, spat out by the system, churned through. And then we as society look down on them for messing up. But they're in a system that I couldn't act any differently regardless of race. If I grew up in the hard part of Detroit, or if I grew up in the barrio of Stockton or whatever it is, doesn't matter what color you are, you're going to struggle and you're going to go to jail.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Doesn't matter what color you are, you're going to struggle and you're going to go to jail.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Now, first of all, I will say there are a ton of people that grow up in Detroit or Stockton or in the white equivalent in Kentucky or WVA or something like that. They become boxers, or they get out and join the army as infantry soldiers. They become school teachers back in the neighborhood. So no, I'm not sympathetic to the idea that you're doomed to be a criminal if you grew up in a working class neighborhood. But in terms of the basic point you're making, this gets into the idea of systemic racism. And I would distinguish the idea of systemic racism from an intelligent version of the idea of intersectionality, which is just that different things affect how you perform in life. So the idea of systemic racism pretty much is, Reilly, okay, maybe you're right about police violence, maybe you're right about interracial crime, and we need to work on crime in our community. But how can you deny that there's this overwhelming body of evidence that racism exists out there? It's subtle, but it's somehow targeting Black people. If you look at incarceration rates, we are more likely to be incarcerated. We're 2 or 2.5 times as likely. If you look at unemployment, we're more likely to be unemployed. If you look at income, the average working Black guy makes 80 to 85% of what the average working white guy does. How can you say that there's not some system of subtle racism that's out there that's sabotaging us? And the short answer would be that most things that are attributed to systemic racism just go away if you adjust for any variables other than race, like we just did in that crude crime example. So the income one, I've said this so often on television or in discussions with you that I'm not going to belabor it, but that's something that is invariably cited by left-wing social scientists. Like, okay, a Black guy makes 85% of what a white guy does. How can you not say that's racist? This was answered back in 1995. The government economist June O'Neill, who leans left, and the conservative researcher Dinesh D'Souza, who, as that title indicates, leans right, looked at this question. And what they found is if you adjust for some fairly simple things, the gap closes to, I believe it was 2% 20 years ago, 25 years ago. One of the factors that was relevant was just age. So this absolutely shocked me when I first found it out. But the average age, or not the average, the most common age for a Black person, which I guess would be the modal average, is 27. For a white, it's 58. So I don't think I need to break down what an impact a 30-year gap, even if that is the mode, between ages would have on income. When I was 27, I was in college, if you count grad school. 58, if your life's gone the way you think it is, you're a master craftsman or you're an executive. That was one of the factors. Another factor is simply living in the South. So because that's where the boats landed, Black people are very, very likely to live in Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama. And we're not doing dramatically worse than, I don't want to make jokes, but some white guy in a trailer home next door. It's just that there are more Black people proportionately. So you have to compare a Black guy in Alabama to the white guy in that trailer home next door. You can't compare him to a white guy on Manhattan Island and say, look, a 30% income difference. Well, there's a 60% cost of living difference. That doesn't make any sense at all. When I lived in Chicago, I paid $2,000 a month for a rabbit hutch briefly before I moved to the suburbs. Here in Kentucky, I'm paying what, $480 for half of a house in one of our nicer neighborhoods. So there's no comparison. But you have to look at age, you have to look at Southern residency. Another variable, this is sometimes presented in sort of hard right terms as just IQ, and that can't be changed. But a better way to put it would just be aptitude test scores. Intelligence plays a role, but how hard did you study for the SAT? How well did you do in school? And what does that translate to on an intelligence test? If you look at where people are going to end up in college, if you look at where people are going to end up in life, SAT score, GRE score, all that's a huge predictor. And again, there are north-south differences there, which, by the way, explain a lot of the Black-white difference. There are Black-white differences there, if we're being honest, although I think those are cultural rather than genetic. But again, that's something you have to adjust for when you're looking at the incomes people earn. And finally, did you finish high school? Not did you go to a great high school? Not did you have racial trust in your teachers? Just did you get out of high school? Did you trust the system, get the sheepskin? If you adjust for those four things, the apparent racial gap in income virtually vanishes. And I guess you could look at maybe one of those and say, well, there's some cultural bias to the tests. I don't think there is. But a lot of the bigger factors there, like how old you are as a group, those don't even theoretically have anything to do with racism. It's an advantage to be a young, vigorous population. But once you take into account these differences that are largely non-racial, the racial gaps that people use to argue for systemic racism almost totally vanish. The simplest one of these actually is when you look at incarceration. There's so many things you could adjust for there. Urban residency, number of cops where you live, age, past record. But the simplest one is just rate of crime year by year. If you look at a 2.4%, a 240% incarceration gap, and then you look at that Bureau of Justice crime report, I mean, I guess you're still talking about what 0.1% that could be attributable to racism. But if you've got a 230% higher crime rate and a 240% higher incarceration rate, it doesn't take Dr. Freud, much less Dr. Einstein, to figure out what's going on here. I mean, that is a direct correlate, as we would say. That is the 99% predictor of incarceration. So when we look at, to find racism, you have to compare like to like. You have to take a black guy from the African-American part of Detroit who's committed 2 previous crimes, and a white guy from the Italian-American part of Detroit, or just a hop over 8 Mile, who's committed 2 previous crimes, and see how they're treated in court. You can't take a wealthy man's son from another city with no previous criminal record and say, well, look, this guy didn't get the same treatment as either of these old boys from Detroit. That doesn't mean anything at all. So systemic racism generally vanishes if you look at things other than race. What I will say, and nobody should disagree on this unless they're actually a racist, past abusive treatment of African Americans, by the way of Appalachian whites, by the way of urban Italians and Irishmen, certainly of Mexicans and natives in the Southwest, if you've ever been there, been to an Indian reservation, but of all these groups, and perhaps especially of blacks, has produced overrepresentation of these people among the poor. Nobody disputes that. Nobody disagrees with that. But what you have to do now is help the poor. You can't just help the black poor and leave the 60 or 70% white and native majority of the poor to starve. That's not morally even an option. So systemic racism fails as a theory. Past historic racism explains a lot of poverty, but now we need to help the poor as opposed to chasing the ghosts of lost racism.
One of the arguments we hear a lot when we talk about this is 400 years of oppression. And I think it sort of takes the logic again out of the argument. Like, I don't know what we do about that. How do you define I mean, every group over the last 400 years can say, yeah, we didn't get our fair share. I mean, what group has? And we'll say the whites, but that doesn't hold up because what the hell is white? And then why are there poor white people? So what about this argument about 400 years of oppression? You know, yes, there's a long history of slavery is terrible, but I would think if you go back 400 years, almost any person has slavery in their genealogy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, so there are a couple of different responses to this. Now, I mean, first of all, I just said, I don't think there are large genetic differences between human populations. So, I mean, if black people are doubly if there are twice as many black people among the poor as you would expect, once you adjust for the variables that I described today, test score, age, and so on, it implies to me very strongly that that is a legacy of past racism. So what I'm saying is actually just extraordinarily simple. I don't see a lot of contemporary systemic racism. If you take contemporary racism and then you adjust for the effect of affirmative action, a black guy and a white guy today that have the same test score are going to go to the same school, or the black guy is going to have an advantage. I mean, that's just a fact. But denying past racism, no, I don't think anybody does that. But I will say that if you want to get into this, there are really 4 points I'd make about racism, and just try to make them as quick as possible. One, of course, the USA has a bloody history, 1. And 2, there's still some racism today. If you ask people basic questions anonymously, like, would you work for or vote for a black man, fully 8% of whites say no. That's probably a good measure of racism. Would you even work with a black guy desk to desk? You can smell each other's food, joke about women. It's one of your buddies. Would you have a black guy in that role? 8% say no. By the way, for blacks, it's like 9% for whites. It's like 7% for Catholics. I mean, so there's a baseline level of human bigotry that exists. No one denies that. Racism in the USA was very bad in the past. I'll just mention the Klan and move on. No one denies that. But I think there's a point, too, here that's rarely made. The USA has spent an extraordinary amount of blood and treasure attempting to expunge that past sin. So the Civil War was fought in 1865. I mean, that's when we freed the slaves, totally eliminated chattel slavery in this country, made that part of the Constitution. By the way, that wasn't after 400 years of slavery. The USA began in 1776, not 1619. So we had 89 years of slavery until we freed the slaves at the cost of 620,000 citizen lives. This was followed by a 20-year period of Reconstruction when there were multiple Black elected officials. Then the South, in particular, fell back into Jim Crow. However, most of the North did not. We saw the Great Migration of Blacks to the North, one of the largest interior migrations in human history. We also saw the Harlem Renaissance. We saw the things that developed from that fully integrated U.S. military by World War II. And then beyond that, we saw the modern civil rights era. So in 1954, Brown v. Board made at least de jure segregation illegal. 1964, the Civil Rights Act made all in-practice discrimination essentially illegal. There are one or two outlier exceptions like golf clubs, but I can't even discriminate against whites or blacks if I own a private restaurant. One of the few countries, not that I want to, money's money, but it's one of the few countries in the world that have done that. 1967, affirmative action with the Philadelphia Plan became the law of the land. So we've literally had pro-minority affirmative action in place for 53 years. People say, 53 years, Pete. I mean, that's 2-3 generations. I mean, so when we talk about, X number of years of slavery, we've also had 3 generations of affirmative action. So that's point 2. So my point 3, I guess, would then be what I've already said. So given both sides of what I just said, when you take gaps that are attributed to racism and adjust for obvious differences like age, most of them vanish. There's still some racism after all we've done, but not as much as people falsely present. And I would then get to a point 4 here. And racism has less of an effect on life at this point than a ton of other things. So if you look at other forms of discrimination, you say, well, blacks couldn't vote till 1865. Women couldn't vote till 1920. I mean, you talk about black people, Irishmen, Jewish men, Hispanics, all of these men were able to work, vote, and so on substantially before any woman. Women literally were disenfranchised until the 1920s. Abusive sex with your wife wasn't potentially rape until, I think, 1996. So women would probably have a jump over any of us when the black guy and Irish guy and so on are arguing about who had it worse, native guy. Any woman could walk in the room and say, probably me. Discrimination against gay Americans, if you want to play this game. I mean, gay people didn't get rights until a decade ago. Obergefell granted basic rights like marriage. So every society has these issues with trying to become a more perfect version of itself, but it's important to look at them in full bright light. It's important to look at them in adult detail. And when we do that, these claims of ongoing systemic racism or of race alone as a barrier as versus class, sex, appearance, IQ, fitness, dangerousness, birth order, so on, that largely vanishes. I'll boast for a second and then move on to the next question. But like when I was in my peak early in college, I mean, I was probably in the top 5% of human beings, at least among little guys, in terms of physical potential, and the top 1 in terms of intellectual potential. I leave false modesty to my Christian friends. I have a PhD. So that gave me an advantage that I would not have had I been white and 300 pounds. It's silly and arrogant to deny, the blessings of the gods. Like physical fitness, mental ability are probably, after bravery, the most important things you can have. And it's almost impossible to measure some of this stuff. You can't walk around with a mirror seeing how beautiful people are. So we tend to focus on a few things like race, but I find that paradigm fails.
Also, when we look at these things, the history of the United States is full of things like affirmative action, a civil rights movement. Just look it up around the world to see where these happen. And then we're also uniquely that we self-select into a more and more diverse population. I mean, we can get into immigration in a little bit, but it's remarkable how diverse we are and how often we generally go in the same direction. But, we just seem to have these counter narratives that sort of disregard all of that I'll bring up Eddie Van Halen in a minute, but he's the American dream. He says so himself. We didn't speak English. We didn't have anything. My dad couldn't get work anymore in Holland. And so we came here, and he dies yesterday, and he is all over the internet because of what he and his brother created. And he didn't know how to play the damn guitar when he got here. Didn't know English, So we have this remarkable thing, and it's sort of, when you talk in terms of like the other end of things, when you are 50 plus years old and you are whatever color you are, or whatever ethnicity, or whatever mix, or whatever, it does seem like almost anybody can outwork their problems. You know, I just saw a story the other day on 60 Minutes about the incredible work people are doing to get autistic kids hired in these STEM fields where they're, if you want to call it an affliction, is actually something that allows them to focus on highway. Show me how many other places where you're seeking as a market, you know, people that have autism and can do pattern analysis way better than the average. That doesn't exist in other places. So you can literally have something that would be at a severe handicap in other countries. Go to China and don't fit into the mold, and let me know how you survive. You know, so these things, in talking in terms of outcomes at the other end of this, if we have systematic racism, why does it appear that you can come from literally anywhere with almost any affliction, you know, and still be able to work yourself into stuff? And then we get this perception that the outcomes are based on race. I don't understand where that comes from. I can't explain it academically.
Yeah, I think it's just I think it's a simple, lazy, univariate argument to make. And I also think it's an argument that advantages a lot of people. So, I mean, I've talked before about the grievance sector in the USA. It basically, simply put, in the past, 1940s, 50s, even 60s, we had genuine racial oppression. Large organized groups sprang up to react to that. I mean, we still have Rainbow Push today. We still have National Action Network today. We have the new lions like the ADL, SPLC, Occupy, BLM. We have the large fringe groups like the Nation of Islam, the Aslan movement. And for decades, all these people have been advocating for different racial identity causes. So, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, I'm a bit of a cynic. We can't really expect them to stop without some outside social pressure. But the reality is, if you're looking at all the things, I'm going to try not to give the whole list again, but if you're looking at all the things that social science says will advantage you in life, race is going to fall about 10th. I mean, it would certainly be behind class. It would be behind sex. If you're a man, it'd be a long ways behind sexual orientation. If you're talking about trading floors or locker rooms or a barracks, I mean, I guess you'd throw gender identity in there. It's only 2% of the population or so, but that'd have a big impact on you, or getting hired if you're walking in there and full-on female fig and you look like me or you. I mean, second language, immigrants, first-generation immigrants are more of a disadvantage than white guys or black guys in every study I've ever seen of reaction to accents. And then you get into the other stuff like IQ, aggression, fitness, weight, height. The average CEO is 5 inches or so taller than the average man, so on down the line. So I find that the crit narrative here totally fails. And I think we've just kind of moved through another question just in talking. I think white privilege pretty much fails as an idea. It's correct that if you are a white guy, you would have a 1 or 2 point advantage over an identical black guy. Nobody denies that, but there aren't any identical guys. I mean, it would be ridiculous to say that I, as a black, upper middle class, reasonably fit, fairly attractive, I think, male, you know, state capital, you know, so on down the line, all of this, graduate degree, would be oppressed relative to someone working in janitorial at Kentucky State. There was a 5'4" Appalachian woman, and, you know, so on down the line. So in reality, life is complex, and it's so complex that when you look at other people, you might as well just judge them as individuals. Beyond the 15 things we've already listed, you have no idea whether someone's battling cancer, has dealt with sexual abuse, just got out of prison. I mean, any of those 3 things would make someone worse off than almost anyone I've just described. You know, whether or not they were bravely fighting that and pretending that wasn't the case. I mean, those are 3 hard hits. Did your father just die? So, I mean, in general, I advocate for treating people as people, not as faceless, interchangeable parts of large groups.
There's someone I know from my friend set who complains about white privilege quite a bit. And the secret is she's white, but doesn't accept it, you know? So it's like, and then you often get pushed into, well, he's either if they acknowledge that you're black, they call you an Uncle Tom. And if they don't, they say, well, he's white. This is where the arguments start to really fall apart. What is it with this racial assignment? What is this thing that we have where we have to deny somebody who they are, what they are, and assign them a political belief? Like, I'm not for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And so apparently I'm become a Trumper because I'm a reasonable person that says, I think both these guys are crap. You know, what is it about our racial, I don't know. Help me understand, why is it that you are simultaneously white and Uncle Tom at the same time?
Well, I think that, I mean, obviously I wouldn't accept either of those labels. I think actually I hear that much more from white liberals than from black guys I play basketball with. I mean, it's just a bunch of nonsense. But I mean, I think that one of the issues in the USA is that we're really bad at understanding certain things like class or complex partisanship. So we use race as a proxy for a lot of things. Like one of my all-time favorite studies looks at the question asked in the thesis, if I remember correctly, is do Lakeisha and Bra Jamal get treated differently than Emily and Becky when they apply for jobs? And when I looked at this, my response was yes, of course they do. Because those are famous working class urban names. Like people are going to wonder who they're getting when Lakeisha applies, whether or not that's fair, as opposed to Emily. What makes you think Emily's not black? I think it's one of the 25 most common black girl names. So when people look at that, their immediate reaction is, oh, this is discrimination against black people. But not really. I guarantee you, and subsequent research has in fact determined this, that if your last name was Freeman or Jefferson or Washington, or your first name was Marcus or Dwayne, you're not going to face substantial discrimination in the job market. Maybe a little, but then you could just put your name as M. Freeman. Probably not much at all. However, that discrimination does come in if you list yourself as Sharkeisha Jenkins. But none of the people doing this research ever paused to stop and ask, at least so far as I could tell, until the last paper that I just cited, is this a class thing or a race thing? And the answer is, like 90% of this stuff, it's almost certainly a class thing. An interesting experiment that would be worth doing is just taking very low-ranking white names like Chevy or Bobby Lee or something like that, and asking, the names of liquor brands, the things you associate with working class white communities, without making fun of those communities, but asking employers whether they'd be willing to hire these guys. And you might see a slight difference between them and the lower end black names, but not much. So we tend to use race as a proxy for a bunch of other stuff. One of those things has become political partisanship. And I mean, I do think that's because of the incredible level of block voting among both African Americans and conservative whites or Southern whites. I mean, about 80%, or no, more than that now, it's about 92% of African Americans vote for the Democratic Party. So when you see black people, it's pretty easy to make a proxy analysis and say, well, those people are liberals. And hopefully that'll change at some point in the future. But again, those things are distinct. You can use any kind of modern computer analysis and separate blackness from liberalism. And you'll find that very often what you thought might be blackness in terms of an effect on behaviors was liberalism, or what you thought might be race in terms of an effect on prejudices was class. That happens all the time.
One of the things, too, I think that goes into the discrimination in job searches is the robot that sorts the resumes. Just to get past that, I don't think that it cares what your name is. It cares where you went to school, and it's built upon, like, these are the things that we want for this job. Whether those things are attached to reality or not, you don't control that. But that can feel, and this kind of goes to the lived experience part of what you can talk about. That goes to like, hey, they didn't do it because I was black. It's in your mind. It's what it's set, because my name is Jamal or Marcus or whatever, or Sean spelled like black folks spell Sean versus the way Irish folks spell Sean. That, you have no way to unconfirm that incorrect error, whether you're an Appalachian poor kid, an Indian guy, any kind of Indian. Is there a problem with our robots and how they sort people and gives us these, because lived experience is the common response we hear about a lot of things. You don't understand because you're not black, or don't tell me I didn't experience this because I experienced these cops targeting me because I was black. I've been targeted because I drove a car that apparently a drug dealer drove. And this is not a fancy car. It was a Dodge Colt with a Supermom license plate on it, So apparently someone had a 4-door Dodge Colt, and I got pulled over all the time. It didn't matter what color I was. It mattered what car I drove.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this gets into kind of another one of these breakdown ideas. I mean, I also, at one point, I think we're going to talk about cultural appropriation.
That's where we're going next. Yes.
Immigration, then kind of dip out. But I mean, so lived experience is one of these popular ideas on the woke left. That's what we're going through. And essentially, this is the idea that you can't criticize someone for anything that they say they've experienced because they know their own life better than you do. And I think now that basic phrase, someone might know their own individual life better than you, I don't really have an objection to that. But the idea that you can't roughly understand what other people experience, or that you can't use logic to judge other people's experiences, is complete nonsense. I read recently that 96% of men think they're good drivers and 98% think they're good lovers. And I think if you're a buddy in the car with the guy, much less, a female partner in the other half of the example, you might be able to say, well, whatever this person thinks, I'm using this objective standard I base on 20 other people, and that's not true. And that applies to a whole bunch of things. So when someone says that they've experienced something, you should certainly give it some respect, but you should also compare that to things you've experienced, because no humans are all that different. And you should compare that to things that other people in his group have said they've experienced, and preferably, if you can, things you've read in the journals and the newspapers and the magazines that really talk about this. And I think right now, and another point to remember here is that people can lie. So when you hear people talk about these incredible, unbelievable sounding experiences that they've had as, an upper middle class Black guy, or a bisexual girl on a college campus, or for that matter, a conservative in a city, you might recall that you've known dozens of people in all three of these groups that didn't have that experience. And you might think, well, that sounds a little fishy. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. So I'll close with a quick comment on lived experience beyond, trust but verify, see what the journals say, see what your other friends say. And that's the context that people put things in. So the comedian Adam Carolla has a great routine about this, where he says, when I'm pulled over by a cop, I assume that cop must be an asshole. Why else would he pull over me, Adam Carolla? And then he does this whole thing like, bang, get her done, like all his catchphrases. But that basic idea, I think, although I'm a Black guy, as a successful upper middle class male, whatever, I feel pretty much the same way. Like, oh, this guy must be having a bad day, must be ticket quoted day. Is it a Thursday? I have those questions. I don't immediately think this is because I am a person of color. But I do think that many people that come out of that paradigm of critical race training, you've had some racial experiences, but you've also chosen to major in a field where everyone discusses theirs over and over and over again. You've read books like 13th or The New Jim Crow about how racist the police are. That's really going to shape your reaction. So to close with an empirical example, in my classes fairly often, I give students a little questionnaire that, among other things, just asks, how many negative experiences do you have in a typical day? Just little things, glares in traffic, arguments, a potential fist fight at the gym, arguing with your girlfriend, whatever. And Black and white kids have reported exactly the same number for the past 4 years. In fact, the white kids, because they're mostly working class Appalachians, report a few more, like one more per day. But the difference is that the Black kids attribute half of them to racism. And when we look at lived experiences, that can't be true. If you have the same amount of negative experiences, unless people are being incredibly nice to you for every reason other than race, half of yours can't be due to hidden racial prejudice, if that makes sense. So I think that a lot of Black guys have been sort of fed this paradigm, fed this information, sort of, you are going to face racism all the time. And when many of the brothers I know face ordinary negative experiences, an argument in the drive-through at a Wendy's, or your girl is mean to you and there's a racial difference or something, the assumption is perhaps that's racism. I'm here to say people are often just jackasses. People often have bad days. That cop you're arguing with, somebody punched him earlier in the shift. We just broke it down. 8% of people maybe are racist. Half of them probably won't express that in public. So the vast majority of the time, 96% of the time, if those numbers are accurate, and they're probably close enough, you have a negative experience with someone that's not due to racial prejudice. And I think that's something that needs to be emphasized.
Yeah, well, and I think ego plays into that too. I'd rather defend my ego than worry about your race, and don't you dare make me feel bad, whatever it is. The other thing to say about this, I think it's important, that's why I'm going to spend a moment here, is if we're going to talk about lived experience, you have a PhD, you have a license to talk about policy and research and numbers. We can't just ignore the fact that you have these credentials. You can't ignore the expertise of somebody else. And you also can't assign someone a lived reality. Oh, well, you're white. You couldn't possibly understand me. That is equally it defeats the thing from the jump, in that we take a racial premise and insert it into a place where your lived experience is somehow a higher value, and exclusive, and reduces, I've heard people question your research, and it's like, no, but these are numbers. And he didn't make these numbers. He analyzed the number. Anyhow, I want to ask you, and this will drive me crazy, but I want to ask you about cultural appropriation. And I also want to say this. Why is appropriation all of a sudden a bad word? It's great when Congress appropriates funds for things that we want. But when it's culture, we start to get a little crazy.
Yeah, cultural appropriation is not a thing at all. I'm glad we got around to this. And this, to me, is the single dumbest woke idea. White privilege, at least, is a bad idea only in context. So it probably is true that in some competitions, whites have a slight advantage. It's simply that if you take a standard privilege scale, if you Google how privileged are you, and you pull up BuzzFeed's or the one I believe from Yale or any of the examples out there, and you administer those to a group of individuals, you're going to find, at least from some informal classroom tests and so on, I've never done this to 10,000 people or the numbers I'd like to, but what you're going to find is that race has a 1 or 2% effect on privilege with everything else adjusted for. Class has a 30-point impact. So white privilege is not a particularly valid idea, but that's due to the contextual greater impact of sex and class, et cetera. At least that's not a stupid idea. Cultural appropriation is just a stupid idea. Cultural appropriation in its most basic form is the idea that taking something from a culture that's not your own is bad. We can knock that out in one sentence. I mean, that would mean you couldn't fly on a jet plane. As I recall, that style of engine was developed by the Germans. You couldn't use a hibachi grill, Japanese. You couldn't drink Guinness Stout, Irish. You couldn't eat shrimp fajitas, Mexican, so on down the line. Now, when people started pointing this out in response to, I believe Anzal Dua was in the first wave, the first scholars to say this back in the 80s, the flip became, well, it's only bad if you take from a society that you've oppressed with or warred with. But again, when you think about that oppressed with or warred with, I mean, whites have oppressed blacks and whites have warred with Mexicans. I mean, we fought a war that reached the level of potential nuclear annihilation with the Japanese 70 years ago. I mean, does that mean that we have to give up sushi and their salarymen have to trade in their beloved Brooks Brothers suits for kimonos and Masamune swords? I mean, I don't see a reason to make a way to make this less than asinine. I mean, I certainly think if you're going to adopt something from a group that's currently poorer than your own, you should do it with some style. You should be aware of where it comes from and so on. But there's no way to prohibit learning from other groups, one. Two, even the warred with or oppressed standard would block half of everything. Blacks couldn't eat tacos. And three, there's no logical way to stop this at race. I mean, if you want to look at oppression, poor people or gay people certainly have suffered more in this country than middle-class blacks or Asians, at least recently. So, I mean, it would seem that no one who is from an upper-class background could perform in the hip-hop or country musical styles that are invented by the poor. A whole bunch of things from Vogue dancing to drag were invented by the gay community. Can non-gays participate in them? This seems like one of those idiotic ideas that's basically just used as a way to guilt white people. If you actually look at this seriously and say, well, can people learn from their gay buddy, their poor buddy, their Irish buddy, their black buddy? No one is really going to say no to that. People are just going to make a great deal of guilt-inducing noise before they get around to admitting there's not much there.
Well, you also have to be prepared to defend your position academically. So when anybody ties their hair in a certain way, you now have to be intelligent about who started tying their hair in a way first, and was it independently or was it copy? It just gets to be ridiculous. And just go enjoy the company of someone else. And language, quit speaking English. It's like it can go on forever. It never stops. Let's talk about if we acknowledge that Black folks in America have a particular problem set that we have struggled to kind of level the playing field on. Why is it that immigrants tend to do so well when they come here with literally nothing? And I'm super pro immigration. My favorite American is the next one. Come on, let's do it. If you want to give up everything and come here, I want you on our team. I love that. So why do immigrants do well, and why do we have such a problem with the Black community and their ability to, our combined ability to integrate and make things so that we don't have these problems anymore?
Well, first of all, one of the things I want to say is, I mean, I think the Black community is one of the most American communities. So I don't think that this is a common mistake that's made in right-wing social science. I don't think there are unique Black problems that don't also exist in poor white communities or in Native communities. I mean, if you want to look at a high rate of drug abuse or a moderate but fairly high rate of murder, high rate of suicide, DUI and fatal wreck, opiate sales, I mean, you'd have to go no further than my home state, which is majority white. I think that internal minorities, and Appalachians and even urban Irishmen have certainly been treated as one historically, as well as African Americans, tend to perform more poorly than immigrants. And why that is a fascinating question in political science. I mean, it's one of the most important things we discuss. But so starting from the top with immigration, first of all, I do have some rules for immigration. This is one of the things I said in Taboo that I thought would be totally non-controversial that actually became one of the most controversial things I said. So I said that I had about 4 baselines for immigrants beyond those we have in place now, like willingness to learn English. All immigrants had to be provably sane. There are simple psychological tests in the game right now, non-criminal, mostly able-bodied, some exceptions, and able to support themselves as demonstrable by a trade skill or an IQ test. And I thought that was just the clearest, most obvious thing. I gave the example of Northern Europe, which admitted something like 160,000 immigrants from developing societies like Somalia, had only been able to find jobs for 600 of them, and now was shipping them back home. And I said, and was paying them to go back, by the way, something like $3,000 in Corona. But I mean, I thought this was ridiculous. And I said, sane, non-criminal, fit, mostly able-bodied, smart or trained enough to do well here. And people immediately started objecting, like, well, if someone was in a wheelchair and they had AIDS, but they wanted to be an American, would you not let them? And it was awkward to answer some of these questions. But I mean, I pretty much stuck with my standard. We want people that'll come here and contribute. So I think that the first question when you look at immigration should be how that benefits the country that's letting in the immigrants. That's worth repeating. The goal of immigration should be benefiting the host country, the country that's accepting these, at the moment, foreigners that want to come there. But with that said, I like immigration too. And yet, probably the best piece of evidence against the woke paradigm, and by the way, also against the alt-right biogenetic paradigm, is provided by the success of immigrants. So if you look at the 20 highest income earning groups in the USA, most of them are not white, although that's not as important to me. And a great many of them are groups that started arriving here relatively recently. So number one is Indian Americans, if I recall correctly. Then you get into Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, Nigerian Americans, Lebanese Americans. It's incredibly diverse. No, there are white groups that do quite well. Also, Jewish Americans and so on down the line, and kudos to them as well. But I mean, the idea that either genetic inability or incredible racism stops immigrants from succeeding would come as news to Filipinos, Nigerians, this diverse group of people that are here being incredibly successful, Koreans, so on down the line, West Indian, Blacks, Arabs in general as a population. I've mentioned Jews, but you can count that as a Caucasian group or not, so forth. What do these groups do that native-born, Black, or Appalachian Americans don't? I think they believe in the idea of America One, and they work hard too. I mean, there really are predictable variables that are good estimators of how you're going to do in life. One of them is tested GPA and or IQ. Both work very well. They mean kind of different things. Both work very well. And the biggest predictor of at least GPA, and I would say of IQ, reading the newer research, is what's called study time. How much time you spend hitting the books, getting ready, tutoring before, after school, how seriously you take school. I believe it was John McWhorter, a qualitative piece, but good one in 2000, argued that there were 4 or 5 variables that seemed to totally close the Black, white, and rich, poor IQ gaps. And if I recall correctly, there were a number of books in the home, which does have some things to do with class. Maybe it even has some genetic confounds. That one's interesting. But the other 3 were just, is your dad present? What grade does your mom demand? And how many hours a day do your parents let you watch television? And even if you're just a working class person, not that brilliant yourself, you can absolutely sit your kid down and demand they not watch much TV, they study pretty hard, and they get ready for school the next day. No alcohol, no weed, you're in bed by 9. And that's what Jamaican parents do. That's what Korean parents do. Those are 2 of the most successful groups in the USA. Totally different racial backgrounds. So, I mean, I think that's what immigrants do. I think immigrants in general come here to succeed. And I think for at least the first 3 generations, immigrants remember another society. And you actually see some drop off in immigrant performance after 3 generations, by the way. So within 3 generations, you need to really assimilate people as Americans or you risk an underclass, by the way. That's a real thing. But and during that period, at least, people remember, okay, this isn't that great, but it's not Vietnam. Remember the sky burning over the jungle? We don't have that here. So you're going to go to math class tomorrow and you're going to knock it out. And you're going to beat the white kids and the black kids. And it doesn't matter whether they speak better English. Keep raising your hand and answer until that accent's gone. I think that's what immigrants do that our population doesn't. So I want selection. I want the best immigrants to come in, but I do endorse those immigrants, and those selected immigrants do very, very well. And that's an absolute rebuttal to certainly the alt-right, but even more so because they at least can argue, well, there's, a selection effect. It's an utter rebuttal to social justice warriors who say that no matter who you get in, it's very difficult as a Black or Latino or even an Asian to overcome, these hurdles of prejudice. And in fact, most of the most successful groups in the country are dark-skinned foreign migrants, and that totally defeats that argument. That's just 1, 2, 3, all snarks or snooks logic. There's no way around it.
The immigrant question is crazy because friend Johnny Walker, he wasn't remarkable in terms of his intellect or his ability to have a job. Matter of fact, it's been the opposite. But he went on more SEAL missions than any SEAL as an interpreter in Iraq, and he earned his way in through being a badass warrior. And his kids almost instantly integrated, and he loved being from Iraq, but he transitioned into something else. And, we're a better nation for it. He's got fantastic kids that love being here, that are part of what we do. They've got Instagram accounts, all those kind of things. And I think we want more of that quality. So whether it is, you're wealthy or you've got a great business idea, or if you want to win a Nobel Prize, you're going to come to America and partner up with somebody else here and do research. Like, that's how you do that, is by coming to the United States. There's a lot of opportunity to do these things. Given my premise that you can simply outwork most of your problems, be recognized for your hard work and your tenacity, is there any group of people that we can identify that has reasonable capability that is oppressed abnormally, that can't just simply outwork their problem?
No, I mean, no. I do think it depends what you mean. So I think that if you were to take myself or you and put us back into a working class white or Black neighborhood at age 16 and, give enough physical fitness to, fight and run again and so on, but they have the knowledge you have, this is how to invest in the market, this is how to apply for college, I have absolutely no doubt that we would get out of the neighborhood and go to Harvard. I mean, there are actually more advantages available if you're a high performer from a working class background. I regularly guide my kids to specific scholarships for Appalachian whites and for African Americans that they did not know existed. And when they open those in both groups, they suddenly start saying, maybe I'm not oppressed. You mean there's $100 million in funding only I can apply for that my white girlfriend can't apply for? Yep. Yeah, that's out there. So I mean, that is the reality, that once you get to at least the working class, virtually nothing oppresses you. You face more racism as a Black guy, but you also benefit from affirmative action. The one thing that I really do think we can do to help the actual poor is teach skills. So, I mean, this is for example, I worked at a Hallmark store once for a couple of months. I got to one of those, as I recall, one of those sort of assistant manager positions, shift. And at one point we were working with people that were this may have been a different job. I'll leave the job off, but at one point, for a charitable purpose, I was in a management role and I was working with people that were trying to transition from welfare to work. And one of the things that we asked them to do was cut lengths of ribbon 6 inches long. And none of them knew how long 6 inches was. This is something I specifically recall. Someone finally said, quote, it's as long as, let's say, a penis. And then they knew how long it was, and they cut the ribbon, and they had these little lengths of ribbon, and I forget what they did after that. But that was an illustration of some of the lack of training that you get if you grow up in a hood area where that's a Caucasian trailer park or that's a housing project. I mean, your mom is quite likely 18 years old, grandma 37. There may be a library nearby, but you don't really know how to resource that. You go to a public school where the teachers unless you put out extraordinary effort, may not try all that hard, so you don't punk them, you don't humiliate them. You're not going to come out of that with an extraordinary set of skills. So it's absolutely accurate that if you took someone with normal skills and put them in that environment, they could succeed pretty easily. And it's also absolutely accurate that we actually feed a ton of money into that environment. Inner city schools in many cases are better funded than poor rural schools, although they're sometimes more poorly funded than upper class city schools. But I don't think the point I just made is in dispute. The question is, what do you do if people don't know how to do a lot of things because dad's not there, they've opted not to play sports, mom's very young, you don't have to work to get money coming in? And that is a tough question. I suppose you could define that as oppression, but it's not oppression due to anyone holding you back. It's oppression of a sort that exists because you're not required to do anything. And all day, all around you, all you see is other people relaxing and not doing anything. This is true both in Appalachian towns where the mines closed and everyone goes to the mailbox on the first of the month, and in housing projects. It's actually very hard to know how to stop that. I mean, ironically, the thing you could most do with that is more intervention from, institutions of the racist society, churches, sports leagues, perhaps the government doing more than giving money, workfare, where you have to go work to collect a welfare check, you have to go dig a lake or work at the local candy store. All those things would pull people out of that environment and teach them skills. But in terms of looking broadly at a group from upper class to lower class within a population, is there a group that is held down, that is not allowed to succeed? No. If you're a member of any major group along race, if we're just talking races, and you are the same as your competition in every way but race, I genuinely don't think you're ever going to face more than a 5 or 6 point disadvantage if you just go out and look for work. I've never seen any evidence that supports that. So no, there is no oppression in the USA in the traditional sense. Formal discrimination is illegal. So racism, to the extent it exists, is a crime, is a residue of an earlier time. And in general, I haven't found that more difficult to overcome. I don't think many people do. I think that what's more difficult to overcome is this weird false idea that prejudice is everywhere. So every time you get in a fight with a white guy or a girl turns you down for a date or someone bumps you in traffic, that is racism. The point is, however, that it isn't.
Just a couple real quick things to clean house here. These things are exasperating sometimes. But one of the things I know you can do, those factors to ensure a better outcome for your kid is something as simple as more words, more complex words spoken in the home. And so by simply just interacting with your kid more, using a word that, these things have a dramatic impact on how well that kid does. The other thing is I wouldn't at all be surprised, and I believe this to be true, that there are more aid dollars to help someone overcome oppression than there are people going for those dollars. Like, I'm positive that there is money. It's like, hey, we have this money earmarked for kids to go to school, but we suck at marketing ourselves. And so no one knows that we have this $5,000 check or this, $10 million grant. We can't give it away. So whoever shows up gets it. I know that, that's why Ask Lesko had a book. You could here's where you can go in the federal government and the private sector to get money. These things exist. You could literally work your way out of oppression and bring your friends along if you learned how to work that system. At least in my mind, I think that's got to be true. There's not a shortage of people with money willing to help people that don't have money.
Yeah, the issue, and I mean, that's why Shark Tank is one of the number one shows on TV. I mean, that's the brutal capitalist version, but they take all these guys, many of whom, like Damon Dash and Mark Cuban, are from pretty working class backgrounds, and they literally bring in entrepreneurs, and if the guy does a good enough pitch, they just give him $500,000. I mean, yes, there's an incredible amount of venture capital funding available in society. I know, I'm in that phase of my life. I mean, yes, there's an incredible amount of grantsmanship funding available in society. I know, I am an academic. Refers to, like, when I started off, I was broke. So there's no doubt at all. Basically, I think that the issue, if you, from a center or right perspective, really want to help people in a charitable sense, one of the issues is connecting funding and skills with people. So I find that when I talk to do-gooder types on the left, there's this sort of vague idea of the government as a combination of God and Santa Claus. where it is the source of all things. You've probably seen this as a soldier, where you'd be told things like, well, why don't we just take this 100,000 tons of rice and drop it off on the Haitian docks? Friends of mine have had these experiences. And the answer is because, baby docks boys control the Haitian docks. And if we do this, if we give them the rice, they'll keep it. And then they'll sell it at extortionate prices to other people. And if you tell this to a white liberal, in my experience, they'll be absolutely shocked. And they'll say things like, but that's the leadership team in that country, or even, but those are people of color. And that doesn't really have much to do with anything. Just broad transfer of funds often just provides opportunities for scumbags and criminals. What you need to do if you want to help people is make opportunities available to them. So there obviously, I'm kind of rambling here, there obviously are more than enough opportunities out there. I mean, if you, as you said, there's a whole book, Federal Government Money. I think that's actually the title as of the past couple of years. There's another book, Grantsmanship Opportunities. Like if you just go online and Google free money, there are all these programs that will give you money for the craziest things, like being a black chicken farmer, but a lot of people don't know about this stuff. I don't think we need more money for this stuff. I do think that I try to do this myself. There's going to be a link to financial opportunities on my website. I mean, I regularly message things like grant opportunities to my entire campus community, but I think that people that are aware of this stuff need to tell people. I think people that have made it and that are still concerned about quote unquote the hood need to give back in that Damon Dash or Jay-Z model, just with a bit less useless wokeness. Other than that, I'm not really sure what you can do. I mean, we in the USA have more than enough money to give virtually everyone all they could need. And that's without raising taxes again on the middle class or doing anything of that kind. It's without dramatically changing the system. There are more than enough opportunities. At every college, there are massive scholarships designed to allow Black and Appalachian and so on kids to go to school that often are unfilled on an annual basis. The issue is connecting people to those resources after giving them enough skills to compete. And how to do that? That's a good question. I mean, let's keep working on it.
Technology. That's the point, right? And if all else fails, quit going for a $15 an hour job. Go become a pipe fitter. It is impossible to be broke if you're reasonably financially savvy and be a pipe fitter. It'll take you 4 years to become a journeyman, and you'll make, it depends on where you live, but $75 an hour, and you'll make way more than $15 an hour from day one all the way through. I mean, you literally can go out and just become a pipe fitter and go, now I can buy a Camaro in 10 years and it'll be badass and, it'll be paid for. It's the path exists for a lot of people. One last thing I want to ask. It's one thing to say, hey, all of these things are possible and the numbers line up that you shouldn't feel oppressed. But the thing is that kid does feel oppressed. They feel like they've got no chance. They've been told that their entire lives. They believe you. What's the next step, man? Like, what does that kid do? That kid who is in Detroit, that kid who is in whatever, in some place where he's like, all right, I believe you. I want to participate. What do they do?
Well, once that kid has started listening to me or to you, the path is pretty simple. I mean, if you want to improve your academics, go to school every day, pay attention in class, but also build up your basics. I mean, buy Hooked on Phonics or pirate it if you're broke enough and you're a high school student. You need to make some moves. But I mean, the same thing with Rosetta Stone if you want to learn a second language. I mean, the tools are out there. So improve your academics. I mean, if I were giving a young man advice, like I've given many of my mentees, every day go to the free high schooler Y gym for an hour a day, get fit, drink lots of water, listen to Rosetta Stone, listen to Hooked on Phonics. These are extremely simple, cheap tools. Build up your background skills. Every day, read a page of the dictionary. Also, by the way, I used to do that when I was a wannabe rapper. Failed as a rapper. Now I know a lot of words. I mean, but, go to class, go to school every day. I mean, if there are problems with gang issues or something like that, get the GED and then continue doing the background training things I'm saying. There's a Y or a Young Men's Hebrew Association in virtually every poor neighborhood. Go to the boxing gym if there's not. The dictionary is available online. It's the free dictionary. There's a library in your neighborhood. So those basics, once you decide you want to do this, are pretty simple. Then from there, where do you go? I mean, the military 4 years will send you to college for free. I mean, that's a great opportunity. And there are hundreds of opportunities like this. There's American Field Service, which charges money for some of its kind of bougie kid trips, but will also send you overseas as kind of a junior varsity Peace Corps. If you're out of high school, there is the Peace Corps. There's the Job Corps, which will literally, and this might be the $15 an hour job you were lightly mocking, but they'll send you to another city and give you a pretty good job and train you in a skill for 2 years. I mean, so there's literally no reason not to join the Job Corps, Peace Corps, Marine Corps. I mean, so that's the next step. Go to community college, take a couple classes that interest you. Once you've decided that the citizenship route will work for you, it's extreme. You can sell drugs while you're doing these things. I mean, I'm not endorsing this, but I'm just saying, like, come on. It's not especially difficult to do these things once you've made that commitment to be a citizen. I think the issue, and you've said this a little better than me, I was a little rambly last time, but the issue really is very simple. Most of the poor in the United States are very vulnerable to the Marxist idea somebody else put you here, if that makes sense. If you're an Appalachian white kid or you're an inner city black kid, you're looking around this broken down, decaying area, and it's very easy to think, is this what they give us? You know, the click in the sky, the big they. You know, this must be prejudice. And when people refer to the systemic prejudice of you being more likely to live here, it's very, very tempting. It's very, very easy to pursue kind of this alternative Marxist vision. But the reality is that in a capitalist society, the market is very good about creating opportunities. There are a lot of entrepreneurs out there. The market isn't so good at connecting every opportunity to every individual person that qualifies. So what we need to do as people who might be a little bit on the right, but who want to help, is connect people to these opportunities. Because the reality for that kid is if he applied to college, he'd have an enormous advantage over a white kid or a rich kid, at least given the same level of test scoring. The reality is that inner city schools, in fact, have some of the most dominant athletic programs. If he wanted to go out for sports, he'd have great chances. The military is willing to recruit from anywhere, I'll tell you that. I mean, if he decides to go put on one of them green suits, he's got plenty of opportunities. I mean, the libraries in cities, even in poor neighborhoods, are considerably bigger and better stocked than they are in rural areas. So the reality is, one, where that kid is might have something to do with historical prejudice, but has almost nothing to do with people in the contemporary world trying to hold him down. There are variables that tie into modern actual behavior, like single motherhood, like young motherhood, that put this guy there. And no one broke down or destroyed the neighborhood that he's living in for either the white or the black guy, except the people that live there now. You know, paint or whitewash for a house is not very expensive. So that realizing that is kind of the first step forward. And then if someone shows up in that mentorship role that can say, well, look, this is how you go become a soldier. This is how you go become a sailor. If you don't want to do that, this is the library. This is Rosetta Stone. You can get a free 6 months on the website. You know, this is how you apply to community college. Community college only costs $160 a credit hour. Once those opportunities are presented to people, I think most people recognize that there's very, very little that's oppressive about living in the world's richest country. But I was a poor kid and I didn't know how to do any of that shit when I was in high school. Like, I had to learn how to apply for jobs. Like, I mean, when I first started applying for jobs, I would ride my bike over to the local mall and I'd walk in and say, you guys hiring? And I was an athlete, like Foot Locker might hire me, you know? And then the next level, like I started taking the paper when I was 18 because one of my uncles insisted on it. So I was like, oh, they have want ads in the paper. Okay, and that's how you get a construction job. That's that next level up. Then you learn about job sites and you learn about wear a tie, even if it's a blue collar job. And then I started learning about applying for jobs on computers. And, you know, this took like 10 years before I was hired as an executive. I was like 26. So, I mean, those of us that want to help should go into mentoring roles where we can speed that along so it doesn't take 10 years for a young man to figure that out. But the reality is that the executive jobs and the construction jobs and the Foot Locker jobs were there all along. I just didn't know how to get to them. Mentorship really is giving a hand up rather than a handout, as cliche as that is.
Yeah, and I think anybody who in the mentor side, I like to do mentoring, you have to put the work in. I can lay the work out. I can say, here's a path. Don't like that path. Here's another path. Don't like that path. But at some point, you have to have the desire, the ganas. You know, if you're going to go to Jaime Escalante, the ganas to do this. You know, to sit in that math class when your friends are all outside playing ball or drinking 40s or chasing girls. You have to decide that I am investing in my own future, my own well-being. And again, I'll submit this: you can outwork damn near any problem, and if you work hard enough, someone's going to say that person works hard as hell. I want them on my team. I want to back them, or whatever it is. I'm on their side. And because everybody wants someone who believes in themselves that much, who believes in whatever they're doing that much, who won't let a lack of work get in the way of themselves and success. There's a lot of people that invest in that. All right, man, we did this for about an hour. Anything else you want to say?
No, I think we've basically covered it. Now, the book itself, Taboo, goes through some of the problems with the hard right as well. You know, the idea of ethno state, the religious right. But the point today was really going through these woke ideas, and thanks for doing that with me. I think we've definitely done it. So, I mean, we started with, are the police murdering black people? Went through interracial crime, 5% of crime, majority black on white. The idea of systemic racism, these gaps mostly vanish if you adjust for things other than race, white privilege, cultural appropriation, lived experiences. So, and finally, I like to close, which is this idea of you're not oppressed, but people do need to mentor you and help you through understanding. In a capitalist society, there are more opportunities than there are in a socialist society, but they're harder to find. I mean, when my mom was sick, that was a complicated, unpleasant process. But I mean, we found all this stuff. You know, hospitals and drug companies will cover most of the treatments that are available out there. I mean, the USA has the best herbal medicines in the world. There are all these charitable programs and grants available, so on down the line. But that's not as simple as just handing over your blue card and getting treatment. And it's very easy to say, I'd prefer just to hand over my blue card and get treatment. However, I genuinely do think that the first option often works as well or better. And I think that, no, national healthcare I kind of support, but I certainly think that when we're talking about what we're talking about now, the things you're saying and that I'm saying are better options for a young man or indeed a young person than just saying, man, this is messed up. There's no chance. Let's change the system. So, I mean, thanks for kind of taking the audience through that with me today. I think the point's been made about each one of these claims. And I think each one, when you really examine it, fails. There's a reason people are coming here from Vietnam and Nigeria and becoming our most successful citizens, and it's not the pervasive racism of the country.
No, I agree. We all got to get up the hill. The machine's always against all of us. Maybe your hill's steeper than mine, maybe not. But over time, if you just get after it, you'll get there. All right, man, I'm going to turn this thing off. Stand by.